psychology and the ape man, and spent time talking about dating methods. And at the end, there was a high school science teacher who raised his hand after I was all done, had heard an enormous amount of evidence, and he said, yeah, but how do you explain that every single short-life radioactive element is totally decayed, totally gone, things that would take tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of years to decay, and yet many of these elements are totally decayed already? How can that be if there haven't been millions of years past? And to be honest, I didn't have a good answer for him. But about 3 months later, I attended the Creation Conference. The International Conference for Creationism happens every 4 years, and Dr. Russ Humphreys and others who have been studying this issue discovered something that I never knew and ties into my specialty at Dow Chemical. And it has to do with helium. You see, helium results from most radioactive decay processes. When uranium and some other radioactive elements decay, they give off a burst of energy, and they also spit out a helium nuclei, which grabs an electron and turns into a helium atom. Whoops, let's move forward again. Okay? And since this decay happens in solid rock, the helium gets trapped inside of that solid rock. The time that it takes for that helium to permeate out of the rock and disappear into the air is a very, very dependable measurement of how long ago that decay happened. The older the rock is, the less helium should be present. Let me just demonstrate that. Suppose, and look here, so where that helium is, if it's still in the rock or is it out of the rock, tells the true age of the rock. Well, one of the places you find these are in little crystals called zircon crystals. Granite is chucked full of these zircon crystals. And inside of these zircon crystals, magnified thousands and thousands of times, you find these little radio discolorations that happen when the radioactive decay happened. The high energy decayed the crystal, so you can actually count those and know how much uranium, or you can do an assay of the rock and find out how much radioactive element was there. From that, you can figure out exactly how much helium had to have been formed inside that rock. And it had to have formed when the rock was hard and cooled, or else those discolorations wouldn't have been there. So if this is a zircon crystal, okay, and right after the granite forms and cools, the radioactive decay happens, bang, let's say that's the uranium. It's just decayed. So now, inside of that zircon crystal is locked a bunch of helium. The discolored water is representative of the helium. Well, suppose that every 100 years, helium is a very energetic little molecule. It bounces around. Some of that helium disappears in another 100 years. Some of the helium disappears another 100 years. Some of the helium works its way out of the rock another 100 years. Some of the helium works its way out of the rock. Well, you don't know when that decay happened, but you can measure all of the radioactive elements that used to be in the rock. So if you measure that every 100 years, because you know how fast it permeates out, we can also measure that. You find out that a fourth of it is gone, and if, each scoop took 100 years, then you know that it's 400 years ago that decay happened. You see, helium, in a balloon like this, you've all seen these kind of balloons, it will stay for a long time. You put it in a rubber balloon, and it would disappear very, very rapidly. These balloons I started out with a balloon like that. It was filled up at the same time. Within a day, the helium had all permeated through the skin and was gone. This one will take weeks, but it will still happen. The helium will permeate out. Well, in a rock, it's not a matter of days or weeks. It's a matter of hundreds of years. But it still happens. Well, no one had ever measured this before, until Russ Humphreys and his team decided, let's just see what is the permeation rate. What he found out, he measured the permeation rate from these zircon crystals. He measured it at different levels so he could account for temperature, and he found out that approximately half of the original helium is still in the rock. And that indicated, based on the permeation rate that he measured very accurately scientifically, that radioactive decay had to have happened in the last 6,000 years. He dated granite around the world at about 6,000 years. There is absolutely no way that helium should still be there unless that radioactive decay, there was a burst of radioactive decay either during the creation period or the flood period or both that locked that helium in that rock, because it should be long gone. If it was 100,000 years old, there'd be no helium left in the rocks. If it was 1,000,000 years old, there'd be absolutely no helium left in the rocks, because it comes out of those crystals so fast. And yet it's still there. You see, there's a lack of helium in the atmosphere. We measure the total amount of helium in the atmosphere. We measure all the helium that's coming in from all known sources. We find out the maximum age of our atmosphere is about 10,000 years. If we look at the amount of helium left in these crystals, we come to the conclusion, and how fast it moves out of those crystals, we find out that they can only be about 6,000 years old. And I know of no explanation other than the fact that those rocks formed quite recently that could put it all there and have it still be there. And so that's kind of a complicated technical discovery, but it's an almost ironclad indication that the Earth is quite young. And you won't find this in your textbooks because it doesn't allow for evolution. Humans are always portrayed as ignorant, stupid idiots as they're older. By the way, all cultural studies, from the Egyptians to the Incas, wherever there were human beings in the past, they were incredibly intelligent and inventive. So it is funny to see them made fun of, but it doesn't match reality. Now, there's a bunch of dating methods that have to do with, where is everybody? Suppose early humans were supposed to have emerged about 4 million years ago. Let's assume that they only lived for 25 years back then. Let's assume there's a stable population of only 100,000. There's about 100,000 or so elephants in Africa, and they're on the endangered species list. Humans are a lot smarter, so that quite likely, even if we evolved and they were emerging from trees, there would have been far more of them. But even with these generous assumptions, if we emerged 4 million years ago, only lived 25 years each, there's never been more than 100,000 people on the planet, there should have been 6 trillion human beings, from apes turning into human beings, that lived. We found a few false skull fragments. There's almost nothing out there. Where are all the bodies? You see, it fits what the Bible has to say. You can trust Scripture. But it doesn't fit what the textbooks and the museums and all the nonsense we hear around us has to say. Where are all the graves? Every ancient people bury their dead. They bury them with valuable artifacts and spears and all sorts of things that they had in life, because all people at all times in all ages know there is something after this life. It's been built into us. Well, let's assume that all of these people that used to live had a longer lifespan. So you had 50 of them. And let's say that there were 1 million people planet-wide for the last 30,000 years. So supposedly Neanderthal man was around 30,000 years ago. You see that date all the time. And there's only been 1 million people on the whole planet. And every one of these people lived 50 years. If you do the simple math, you find out there should have been 600 million graves in that period of time. 600 million. We found a few hundred. Where are all the graves? Where are all the bodies? Where are all the graves? And where are all the people? You see, as far back as we go in population studies, we find that historically, clear back to the time of Christ and beyond, where censuses were going and you can estimate population based on anthropology and studies, that the world population seems to have doubled every 150 years. And this is despite wars that wiped out massive numbers of people, famine and disease. The world population continues to double about every 150 years. Well, if you start with 6 people coming off the ark, Noah and his wife would have had no more children, so you have 6 people, 3 sons with 3 daughters, and you double them. It took them 150 years to be up to 12 people, which is very generous. You double it again, you double it again, you double it again, you'd find out you would have had to double it 30 times to reach the present world population. Only 30 times. 30 times 150 years for each doubling means That would take about 4,500 years of world history. That's about the time the Bible tells us Noah's flood happened and the people from the ark spread out across the world. You can trust the Bible. You see, when you do